Julio's life had always been silent. It wasn't just the absence of words, it was the weight of memories that seemed to fill every room in their small house. A tragic accident had robbed him of his voice, not just physically, but emotionally. The crash that killed his mother and sister left a scar on his soul so deep that even time couldn't heal it. His father, Taylor, didn't make things any easier. Cold and distant, he seemed to resent Julio, blaming him for the tragedy that had shattered their family. But how could a child bear the weight of such guilt? And yet, there Julio was, trapped in a world of silence and grief, struggling to understand why his father could not show him the love he so desperately needed. At the tender age of 18, Julio found himself alone in a home filled with the echoes of the past. Every corner seemed to remind him of the lives lost and the bond with his father that was never formed. Despite his father's harshness, Julio continued to yearn for the kind of love a son should get from a father. Instead, Taylor drowned his sorrows in alcohol, a coping mechanism that only drove them further apart. Julio, still unable to speak, watched it all from the sidelines. His own pain was compounded by the realization that his father's self-destructive tendencies were not a result of love lost, but of guilt and anger that he had never been able to express. As the years passed, Julio's silence became more than just a coping mechanism. It was his only way to survive. He didn't know how to deal with the emotional scars left by the tragedy. His father's rejection made it harder to reach out, and the isolation grew deeper with each passing day. Yet, there was a part of him that held on to a sliver of hope, believing that somehow, the man who had once loved him might return. But the more Julio waited, the more he realized that nothing would ever be the same again. This was the reality he faced, alone, with no one to help him understand how to heal from the wounds of the past. The silence was both a comfort and a curse. Julio spent his days trapped in the hum of his own thoughts, constantly replaying the events of that fateful day, the accident that took everything. He had been so young when it happened, too young to understand the finality of death, but old enough to remember the pain of losing his family. The image of his mother's face as she died, and his sister's hand slipping from his, haunted him. Yet, no matter how much he longed to speak, to shout, to scream, his voice remained absent. It was as if his body and mind had conspired to keep him silent, a constant reminder of the pain he couldn't express. While Julio's world was consumed by silence, his father's was filled with noise, the clinking of bottles, the bitter taste of regret, and the hollow echo of self-loathing. Taylor never once considered how his behavior might affect his son. The harsh words he often used to degrade Julio, the insults, and the glaring lack of affection left scars too deep to heal. Taylor had always blamed Julio, silently blaming him for the tragedy, for the pain he could not forget. In a twisted way, it seemed as if the accident was Julio's fault, the wreckage of their lives laid at the feet of an innocent boy who bore the brunt of his father's frustration. Julio tried to make sense of it all, but how could he? How could a boy who couldn't even speak face the cruel, unforgiving world around him? Every day felt like a battle, against his own emotions, against his father's coldness, and against the memories that refused to fade. Yet, in the darkest corners of his mind, Julio longed for one thing: to be seen, to be understood, to have someone tell him that it wasn't his fault. But his father, wrapped in his own misery, could never offer him that. And so, Julio retreated further into himself, a silent prisoner in a house that had once been full of life and love. One evening, the tension in the house reached a breaking point. Julio sat in the corner of their dimly lit living room, his eyes focused on his father, who was swaying slightly in his chair, a bottle of whiskey in hand. Taylor was planning to drive his younger daughter to school, as usual, but tonight was different. Tonight, Julio's silent world was shattered. He could feel it in his gut, the same sickening sensation that always rose before something bad happened. His father, intoxicated and oblivious, had no intention of staying off the road. Julio, unable to bear it any longer, stood up. For the first time in years, he found his voice. "Don't drive," he said, his voice shaky but clear. "You'll cause another accident." The words felt like they had been trapped inside him for a lifetime. As soon as they left his mouth, a profound silence followed, as if the entire world had frozen in place. His father stopped, eyes wide with shock, and in that instant, the truth hung heavy in the air. Julio's voice wasn't just a plea, it was the breaking of a dam, the flood of years of pain and silence. And with those words, Julio unknowingly revealed the most painful truth of all. It had been his father who, under the influence of alcohol, had caused the tragic accident all those years ago. That day had never been Julio's fault, but he had carried the burden alone. Now, the truth had escaped, and there was no turning back. The air was thick with tension as Taylor stared at his son, disbelief and anger swirling in his eyes. The quietness of the moment was deafening, but it didn't last long. Taylor's face twisted, and his hands trembled. Julio had finally spoken, but the cost was greater than he could have imagined. The revelation had exposed not only the painful truth about the accident, but also the deep, unresolved pain that had plagued their relationship for years. This moment, Julio's first words, would mark the beginning of a confrontation neither father nor son were ready for. Yet, neither could escape the aftermath of that long-silenced truth. Julio's voice had shattered the silence, but it didn't bring the peace he had hoped for. Instead, the weight of the truth seemed to suffocate him. As the days passed, his father's anger grew, and the tension between them thickened. Taylor had always been a man of few words, but now his silence felt like an impenetrable wall. He had no intention of admitting his guilt, and Julio's outburst only seemed to deepen the rift between them. In some ways, it was easier to remain mute. Talking hadn't solved anything, and the echoes of his voice still rattled in his mind. Yet, as the quiet lingered, Julio could feel a faint stir inside him, a flicker of hope, of something more than just the silence he had lived with for so long. But was it worth it? Was the truth worth the emotional cost of confronting his father? Every morning, Julio watched his father slowly crumble under the weight of his own regrets. Taylor's once strong exterior had weakened, and the alcohol had become more than just a crutch. It was his way of drowning out the guilt that now haunted him. But as much as Taylor tried to escape the past, it was clear that the damage had been done. Julio had found his voice, and there was no going back. The house was still heavy with unspoken words, but now they lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Julio's internal world was unraveling, and with it, so was the carefully constructed silence he had relied on for so long. He began to wonder, could he truly live this way forever, a prisoner to his own emotions, or would the truth set him free? Despite his father's distance, Julio couldn't help but notice the moments when Taylor's mask faltered, the way his hands trembled when he reached for another drink, the way his eyes seemed to search for something in the distance, something beyond the pain. Taylor's silence, like Julio's, spoke volumes, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comforted. It was a silence that screamed of regret, of a man too proud to admit his mistakes. Julio longed for the father he once knew, the one who had laughed with him in the kitchen, who had held him tight when he scraped his knee. But that man was long gone. In his place stood a broken figure, a man whose own guilt was poisoning the relationship that was already on the verge of collapse. Julio's heart ached for the father who would never return, but he also knew that healing wouldn't come from waiting for someone who couldn't face his own demons. The days passed like a slow, painful crawl, each one filled with the tension of unspoken words. Julio had never been one to express himself, but now it seemed impossible to contain the flood of emotions inside him. He would sit quietly, watching the world around him move, but feeling like an outsider in his own life. His silence had once been his shield, protecting him from the world and from the truth he had never been able to speak. But now that he had broken the silence, it felt like everything had changed. It wasn't just his relationship with his father that had been shattered. It was his entire world. Julio longed for a sense of normalcy, for the days when his life had been simple and filled with laughter. He would sometimes sit by the window, watching children playing outside, and a pang of longing would strike his chest. He missed the carefree days of childhood, before everything had gone wrong. His heart ached for his mother's comforting voice, and the way she would tuck him in at night, promising that everything would be okay. But that world was gone, and no amount of wishing could bring it back. The only thing left for Julio was the painful reality of his father's absence, the man who once held him close, but now seemed like a stranger. There were moments when Julio thought about leaving, running away from it all. He wondered if the silence had become too much for him to bear, if he was forever doomed to live in this emotional prison. The thought of escaping, of finding a place where he could finally be himself, was a tempting one. But where would he go? Who would he become without the weight of his past? He couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter where he went, the silence would follow him. It was a part of him now, as much a part of his identity as the grief he carried in his heart. Julio wasn't sure what he needed. He wasn't even sure if he knew how to ask for help, but he knew this: the silence couldn't be the answer forever. The silence between father and son was no longer comfortable. It had become a battleground. Julio, though still unable to speak, felt the weight of every unspoken word pressing down on him. He had finally broken his silence once, but it hadn't been enough. It hadn't brought the relief he thought it might, nor had it bridged the chasm between him and his father. Every time he looked at Taylor, he saw a man more consumed by guilt than ever before, lost in a sea of his own making. Yet, even in his torment, Taylor never reached out. The coldness in his eyes, the way he looked right through Julio as though he wasn't even there, made Julio's heart ache with a pain he could barely comprehend. Sometimes, late at night, Julio would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if his father even saw him anymore. The man who had once been his protector now seemed like a distant, unreachable figure. In those moments, Julio's mind would drift back to the past, the days before the crash, when things had been different. He remembered the laughter, the warmth of his mother's embrace, and the way his sister's giggles filled the house. But those memories were fading, slipping through his fingers like sand. What was left of those days? Only the silence, only the grief that neither father nor son had ever truly addressed. As the weeks turned into months, Julio became increasingly withdrawn. He still didn't speak, but now it felt like the silence wasn't just something he wore. It was something that had seeped into the very fabric of his being. He went through the motions of life, but nothing felt real anymore. His father's anger, his own isolation, everything seemed to blur together, forming a painful, never-ending cycle. Yet, despite the weight of his own sorrow, there was still a small part of him that clung to the hope that one day, things might change. That somehow, in some way, the silence would break, and he and his father could finally heal. But that day felt far off, like a distant dream that might never come true. It was a typical morning, one that felt no different from the countless others before it. The sun barely pierced through the blinds, casting faint stripes of light across the kitchen floor. Julio sat quietly at the table, his eyes vacant as he watched his father, Taylor, stumble through his morning routine. The smell of stale alcohol lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of burnt toast. Julio's heart weighed heavy as he observed the same grim scene unfolding again, the same self-destructive pattern. Taylor, still nursing a hangover from the night before, didn't even acknowledge his son's presence. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time, until Taylor, in his usual haze, grabbed the keys to the car and announced he was taking his younger daughter to school. But something in Julio snapped. He stood up, the words rising from deep within him, louder than anything he had ever felt. The years of silent suffering, the years of bearing witness to his father's destructive spiral, all came to a head in that one moment. He couldn't let it happen again. He couldn't watch his father drive off into another tragedy, another potential loss that would haunt him forever. For the first time in years, Julio opened his mouth. "Don't drive," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. "You'll cause another accident." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything stopped. Taylor's eyes met his for the first time in years, and the shock was evident. He froze, mid-step, his hand still gripping the car keys. Julio had never spoken like that. Never once had he broken his silence. But in that instant, something inside him broke free. His voice, the voice that had been buried under years of pain, shame, and fear, was finally unleashed. It was raw, desperate, but full of the truth that had been festering for so long. And then, in that same breath, the unthinkable happened. Julio revealed the truth that had haunted him for so many years. "It was you," he whispered. "You were the one driving. You killed them." Taylor stood frozen, as if the world had just crumbled around him. The truth, Julio's voice breaking the silence, was too much for him to process. The weight of those words seemed to pull him into a deep, suffocating darkness. His grip on the keys tightened, and for a brief moment, he looked like a man who had been caught in the act of some unspeakable crime. The guilt, the shame, everything he had buried for so many years now stared him straight in the face. But there was no confession, no apology. Instead, his face contorted in anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, his voice thick with denial. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something to hold on to, but there was nothing. He couldn't face the truth, couldn't face the pain of what he had done. The air in the room became heavy, suffocating. As the two stood facing each other, Julio had never expected his father to react this way, but deep down, he knew that this moment, this confrontation, was inevitable. For all the years of silence, for all the emotional neglect, Julio had been carrying the burden alone, but now, the truth was out, and it had shattered everything. Julio's heart raced as he stood his ground, feeling the weight of every word that had just left his mouth. "I know it was you," he said, his voice trembling, but resolute. "You've been running from it all these years, but I'm not running anymore." Taylor's expression faltered for a split second, and for the briefest of moments, Julio saw something in his father's eyes, something that looked like regret, or perhaps fear, but then it was gone, replaced by the same coldness Julio had come to expect. "You're wrong," Taylor snarled, the words laced with venom. "This is your fault. You never should have survived. They should have been the ones to live, not you." The words hit Julio like a physical blow, the sting of his father's hatred cutting through the fragile layers of hope he had held onto for so long. Julio's chest tightened, the pain of the words threatening to choke him, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. This moment, this confrontation, was everything. It was the truth being laid bare. And no matter how ugly or painful it was the only path forward. "No," Julio said, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "It wasn't my fault. It was never my fault." The silence that followed Julio's words was deafening. It was as if the air itself had thickened, heavy with the weight of the revelation. Taylor's face twisted in a mix of disbelief and anger, and for a moment, Julio feared his father might lash out physically. But instead, Taylor took a shaky step back, his eyes glazed with tears he couldn't bring himself to shed. His hands trembled as they dropped to his sides, the car keys slipping from his fingers and hitting the floor with a hollow clink. For a fleeting second, Julio thought his father might finally break, might finally admit to what he had done, but instead, Taylor turned away, muttering bitterly under his breath, "I never wanted this. None of it." Julio's heart sank, but he remained rooted to the spot. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. "You don't get to run anymore," Julio said, his voice steady now, no longer trembling. The years of silence, the years of living in the shadows of his father's neglect, had culminated in this one painful truth. He had spoken, and there was no taking it back. His father's actions, his refusal to face the past, had hurt him in ways words couldn't express. But in that moment, Julio knew something had changed. No matter how much Taylor wanted to bury the truth, it was out there now, hanging between them like a bitter wind. For a long time, there was no more talking. Taylor sat down heavily in his chair, his face in his hands as the tears finally came. Julio, despite the anger and sadness that surged through him, felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Pity, not for the man who had caused him so much pain, but for the broken, defeated figure sitting before him. This man, his father, had been so consumed by his guilt and shame that he had never allowed himself the freedom to heal. And Julio, for the first time in his life, realized that the silence he had lived with wasn't just his burden to bear, it was theirs, both father and son. But even as the reality of the situation set in, Julio knew that this was only the beginning. The road to healing would be long and painful. He didn't know what the future held, or whether his relationship with his father could ever be repaired. What he did know was this: he had found his voice, and with it, he had taken the first step toward freeing himself from the chains of the past. For once, he was no longer afraid of the truth, and that, in itself, was the most powerful thing he had ever done. The days after the confrontation were filled with a quiet unease, a tension that seemed to pulse in the air between father and son. Taylor's guilt weighed heavily on him, but his pride refused to let him admit it. He spent more time in his room, isolating himself from the world, lost in the turmoil of his own mind. Meanwhile, Julio, though still hurt by his father's anger and denial, began to feel a shift within himself. The silence that had once consumed him no longer held the same power. He had spoken the truth, and now he had to live with it. But even as his father retreated further into his self-imposed prison, Julio found himself questioning everything: his past, his future, and what it meant to finally be free of the silence that had bound him for so long. The weight of Taylor's words, the accusations, still lingered in the air. "You never should have survived," they echoed in Julio's mind, each repetition adding another layer of pain to an already shattered heart. Yet despite his father's harshness, Julio realized that the true battle was not with Taylor, but with the self-doubt that had festered inside him for years. The shame, the guilt, the belief that he was somehow responsible for the tragedy, they were all deeply ingrained within him, buried beneath layers of silence and fear. But now, As the truth hung in the air, Julio could no longer ignore it. He had to face the truth of who he was and what he had endured. Not just at the hands of his father, but at the hands of his own mind. The confrontation had forced them both to confront the past, but it had done little to heal the wounds between them. Taylor's anger was raw, his guilt a poison that seeped into everything he did. But it wasn't just his father who had to change. Julio had to learn how to forgive himself. The emotional scars that had festered for so long needed to be acknowledged, processed, and ultimately released. Julio knew this wouldn't be easy. Forgiveness wasn't a one-time event. It was a journey. And though the road ahead seemed daunting, Julio knew that finding peace meant embracing the difficult emotions that came with it. Only then could he begin to rebuild his life, to understand that he was more than the tragedy that had defined him for so long. The following days were filled with an unsettling quiet. The house, once loud with the noise of family life, now felt like a tomb. Taylor, still reeling from the revelation, refused to engage with Julio. He couldn't bring himself to face the truth he had been running from for years. Instead, he drank more, withdrew further, and let his guilt drown him. Julio watched all of this from the sidelines, feeling both distant and deeply connected to his father in a way he never had before. It was as if they were both caught in a whirlpool of regret, unable to escape. And yet, despite the emotional chaos that surrounded them, Julio realized that something had shifted within him. He had confronted his past, and for the first time, he wasn't allowing the weight of it to define his future. There were moments when Julio wanted to lash out, to shout, to demand that his father face the truth, but he knew deep down that Taylor's journey was his own to make. And so, Julio kept his distance, allowing his father to wrestle with his own demons. The anger that had once consumed him was starting to fade, replaced by a deep sorrow that he couldn't quite explain. In the quiet of his room, Julio would often sit in the stillness, reflecting on the pain, the betrayal, and the years of silence. But now, the silence felt different. It wasn't an oppressive weight. It was a space for healing, for understanding. And though he had no idea how to move forward, Julio knew that he had to make peace with himself first, before he could ever expect peace from his father. Taylor, meanwhile, continued to spiral. His anger festered, and his guilt grew heavier with each passing day. He couldn't bring himself to admit the truth, let alone face the consequences of his actions. The weight of his own regret was suffocating. He wanted to reach out to Julio, to offer some form of apology or explanation, but he didn't know how. His pride, his shame, and his inability to forgive himself kept him trapped. He had failed as a father, as a husband, and now the truth was out in the open. But instead of confronting it, he buried himself deeper in his own emotional prison. The gap between father and son widened with each passing day, and the question remained, could they ever bridge it? As time passed, the tension between father and son became an unspoken routine. Julio knew that the confrontation had opened up a wound in both of them, one that couldn't be ignored. But no matter how much he longed for reconciliation, he couldn't force it. His father's refusal to acknowledge his actions weighed heavily on him. Yet Julio began to realize that he couldn't carry that burden alone anymore. The truth had come to light, and it was no longer just about the accident. It was about the years of neglect, the emotional scars they had both accumulated, and the way their unspoken anger had shaped their lives. Julio felt a subtle shift within himself, a growing understanding that the forgiveness he sought from his father would never come easily. But perhaps the first step toward healing was forgiving himself. In the silence that enveloped them, Julio found a new strength. It wasn't in the expectation of his father's apology, but in his own ability to accept the truth. He had spent so many years believing that he was the one at fault, the one who had caused the tragedy. But the reality was clear now. It wasn't his fault. He had carried the weight of that lie for far too long, and the burden was not his to bear. Julio's voice, though still soft and hesitant, had broken the silence that had defined his life. And in that moment of vulnerability, he realized that speaking the truth wasn't just about confronting his father. It was about confronting himself. It was about finally letting go of the guilt and shame that had kept him silent for so long. Taylor, on the other hand, continued to wrestle with the fallout of the truth. His inability to face his past had crippled him, and though he might never find a way to express the remorse he felt, the truth had already done its work. It had forced both of them to acknowledge the damage that had been done, the wounds that had never healed. As he sat in his chair, staring blankly at the floor. Taylor couldn't help but wonder if it was too late for redemption. Could he ever fix the broken pieces of his relationship with his son? Could they ever move past the pain, the lies, the years of silence? For now, all he could do was sit in the mess he had created, unsure of what to do next. But Julio, for the first time, felt a small glimmer of hope, not because he expected his father to change overnight, but because he had finally taken control of his own healing. He had broken free from the silence, and in doing so had reclaimed his voice, his strength, and his future. Days turned into weeks, and the heavy silence between Julio and his father started to shift, though not in the way Julio had hoped. The realization that Taylor's guilt had him bound in a prison of his own making lingered in the air like a storm cloud, but something within Julio had changed. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of peace. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared, or that his father had suddenly become a loving parent. No, it was far from that. But Julio had finally learned to let go of the heavy burden he had carried for so long. The silence had been broken, and with it, he began to reclaim his own voice. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but now, it wasn't about the approval of his father. It was about finding his own sense of peace, his own strength to move forward, regardless of the past. It wasn't an instant transformation. Julio's path to healing was jagged and uncertain, filled with moments of doubt and hesitation. But every step he took away from the past, every day he faced the world without the weight of his silence, was a victory. He began to rebuild himself piece by piece, starting with the simple acts of self-care he had long ignored. He reached out to friends, though the connection felt fragile at first. He even began to speak to a counselor, someone who helped him unravel the complexities of his feelings, the layers of pain that had been buried for so long. The truth was, Julio didn't have all the answers. He didn't know if he'd ever fully heal from the trauma of his past, but he was finally taking the steps toward healing, steps he had never thought possible before. For Taylor, the path was much darker. He watched from the sidelines as his son began to find his way, a quiet ache growing within him. The man who had once held all the power now felt like a bystander in his own life. He had failed as a father, and no amount of regret could change that. But seeing Julio slowly reclaim his life, finding his voice again, made something stir within Taylor. It was a flicker of recognition, perhaps even regret, but it was a small step. Taylor had never known how to love his son the way he deserved, but as he watched Julio move forward, he couldn't help but wonder if there was still time. Time to rebuild, time to reconnect, time to face the truth of what he had done. As Julio continued to carve out a new path for himself, he began to experience small, quiet moments of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from a life without struggle, but the kind that was born out of acceptance and understanding. Julio started to see that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about finding a way to live with it, to carry the memories without letting them define who he was. It was in the quiet moments, like walking alone in the park or sitting by the window with a cup of tea, that Julio began to rediscover himself. He wasn't the broken boy who had lost everything. He was someone new, someone who had faced the darkness and come out stronger on the other side. His relationship with his father, however, remained strained. Taylor, though visibly affected by the changes in his son, still struggled with his own demons. He never admitted his guilt out loud, but there were moments when his eyes softened, when his shoulders seemed to slump under the weight of his regrets. Taylor couldn't bring himself to apologize to Julio, not directly, not in the way he knew his son needed. But Julio, in his own quiet way, understood that words could only do so much. It wasn't the apology that would heal him. It was the distance. The freedom to live his life without being shackled by his father's anger. He had given up waiting for a perfect reconciliation. Instead, he focused on himself, on building a future that didn't depend on his father's approval. One evening, as Julio sat in the living room, his father entered quietly, looking more worn than usual. He didn't say a word, but he stood there for a moment, watching his son, as if measuring the distance between them. For the first time in years, there was no anger. No bitterness in his gaze, just a tired resignation. It was in that moment that Julio realized something important. Forgiveness, even if unspoken, was a process that didn't need to come from just one side. Perhaps Taylor couldn't offer the apology he so desperately needed, but Julio had already taken the first steps toward healing. He had forgiven himself, and that was enough. The truth had set him free, not just from the past, but from the silence that had held him captive for so long. The next few months were quieter, but not in the sense that everything was perfect. There were still moments of tension between father and son. Still days when Taylor's anger would resurface. Still days when Julio felt the weight of his past pressing on his chest. But they had reached a delicate understanding, an unspoken agreement that they would simply exist alongside each other. It wasn't a perfect relationship, nor was it a healed one, but it was a start. And for Julio, that was enough. He no longer depended on his father's approval to feel whole, to feel worthy of love. He had learned that his worth was never tied to the mistakes or the silence of others. It was something he had to claim for himself. Julio's journey wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it. He began to explore new interests, to form new relationships with people who saw him for who he was, not who he had been. Slowly, he found his place in the world again. He started attending therapy regularly, and each session peeled back another layer of the emotional armor he had built over the years. He started to find joy in the little things again, the smell of fresh rain, the sound of his footsteps on a quiet street, the warmth of a hug from a friend. These small, simple moments became his lifeline, his way of reconnecting with the world around him. As the seasons changed, so did Julio. He was no longer the boy who had carried the weight of his family's tragedy in silence. He was a man, forged by the flames of pain and loss, but stronger for it. His relationship with his father, though still far from perfect, was no longer the center of his world. Julio had finally understood that healing came from within, and though it was an ongoing process, he had made peace with the past. It wasn't about forgetting or pretending it didn't matter. It was about choosing to move forward, to find peace, and to embrace the future with open arms.